Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Voices of Music Therapy podcast. I'm your host, Brian Locascio, and today's guest is a board-certified music therapist and graduate student with Colorado State University. He completed his undergraduate degree in music therapy and psychology through the University of Missouri-Kansas City Conservatory in 2018. He completed his internship at a residential psychiatric treatment facility in South Kansas City and is passionate about trauma-informed care as well as LGBTQIA2+ affirmative care within music therapy practice. Currently, our guest serves on the Midwestern region of AMTA's board of directors as social media coordinator and is a part of the editorial team for Dialogues in Music Therapy Education, a new music therapy journal. He has presented on trauma-informed care, LGBTQIA2+ matters, and work within corrections at the local, regional, and national levels. He'll be starting his doctoral studies in clinical psychology in the fall of 2021. I am happy and proud and so excited to introduce you to our guest, Alex Peuser.
Hey, Brian. It is so great to be here.
Yes, thank you. We are ecstatic to hear from you and hear from your experiences and really hear about this new journey that you found yourself headed on, I guess.
It's going to be a journey.
Well, thank you once again for coming on to the show. And for those who are listening who may not have experience with music therapy, or for those looking to get a different perspective, I want to hear from you how you define music therapy and the way that it works.
Okay. So I think a lot of times as music therapists, we tend to define music therapy as the use of music to work on non-musical goals and objectives. And I think that's a relatively okay definition. I think that we also in that definition add in that this has to be done under the supervision of a board certified music therapist. Again, I think that's a great definition. I also think that that definition leaves a little room for expansion. So not only would I use that definition for music therapy, but I would also be looking at how music is used within culture and how music is used in general. The relationship between the service user and music, that can also be music therapy. I don't think that it has to be as rigid as maybe it is defined currently. I would also say that that definition, the first definition of music therapy, is found largely within the Midwest. We are a very cognitive, behaviorally oriented region as opposed to a few others. And so I think that definition is a definition that we in the Midwest really latch onto, but we could look a little bit further, especially in like the relationship to music that the people that we are working with have.
I think that's very important for people to listen to and to incorporate. My question to you, and it may be too big of a question to ask because you're only one person, but what do you think that would look like? What are some types of wording that you think could be more helpful to include culture and that experience through music as a therapeutic?
That is a very good question, and definitely not one that I have an entire answer for right now. But I think there are definitely scholars out there who are looking at this and have looked at this. Let's see, Dr. Leonard, or even Dr. Potvin, or Dr. Abrams. Those would all be individuals who I think maybe ascribe partially to this definition. Dr. Thomas, Dr. Natasha Thomas, I think would be another one who would ascribe to kind of that expansion of this definition of music therapy. And the only reason I think this expansion is important is because I think the first definition leads us as music therapists to believe that we own music and we own its quote unquote healing properties, and we don't. It's not my job to say that the social worker over here using music in their practice is like totally incorrect in doing so. It's not my job to say that the service user who really gets something out of listening to X, Y, or Z or doing X, Y, or Z is not actually receiving something therapeutic because they're not experiencing that with a board certified music therapist. So I think our current definition based on what AMTA has put out is very limiting. And so if we take into account the person as well as their culture and maybe at times remove the music therapist, we have a broader definition that isn't as hierarchical and isn't as like fraught in power or wrought in power. Like, and that power is seen from like, oh, here is this music therapist who is giving you this thing. And like only in music therapy with a board certified music therapist will you experience that. And I think that's an incorrect way to think about what we do as professionals and what we hope for the people that we work with.
I think you had some really interesting points in that definition. It was very interesting to hear from you as well, kind of speaking about like, what would that look like if you removed the therapist? Obviously, like the therapist being present in music therapy, right, is one of the big aspects that we define within our profession. We have the therapist, the music, and the client. So it's interesting to kind of hear your take on it as well. And based off of what you were just saying, for those who are listening and heard Alex mention regions with the Midwestern region, let me break that down because I don't think we've discussed that on the show. There are precisely 7 regions. The first is the Midwest region, first only because it's the one I'm from and no actual reason why it should be first. Southwestern region, followed by Western region. Then we have Southeastern region, the Great Lakes region, Mid-Atlantic region, and then way up at Maine, we have the New England region. So kind of in that Vermont area, Massachusetts. So that's just to kind of give you all an idea. Those regions are separated by people in charge. So we have like our presidents of that region. We have our social media coordinators of different regions, hence Alex being the social media coordinator for the Midwestern region. So moving from there, we kind of have our understanding and view of how you look at music therapy, which is very helpful and can show really, really great opportunities for growth within our profession. But what led you to music therapy and kind of finding your own definition of it?
I'll start with the first question of those two because they're related, but definitely different. I guess what led me to music therapy was that I had all through high school pretty much, and even probably some of middle school, I had wanted to be a doctor, like a medical doctor. I wanted to work in an ER and like that is what I wanted to do. And I like so much so that several of the teachers that I had in high school, one of them was an ER physician. So I had worked with him to kind of like determine, hey, is this like really what I want to do? And I was on track to like graduate high school and go into like a med-based program. And then my sophomore and junior year of high school came along and I was like, oh, I really don't like chemistry. Oh, I really like, I'm good at biology and I'm good at like anatomy, but I don't love these things. Like these are not things that I can see myself learning about day in and day out. Not my thing. So that's when I was like, oh, maybe, medicine, not for me. But I still wanted a profession that I was helping other people. And I also wanted to do something that I enjoyed. And so at the time, my choir director was like, have you heard of music therapy? And I was like, no, I have not. So I did a little research there and I was like, oh, this is really cool. There are several universities within my general vicinity that offer this degree. I didn't really know much about it going into it and kind of gained more perspective those last 2 years of high school. And that's kind of how I started this journey to becoming a music therapist, which was, I guess, what got me here.
It's amazing to always hear individuals speak about how their choir directors or how their music educators are connecting people to music therapy. At least from my experience, I feel as though like there's always a battle between the two, because one kind of music therapy kind of stemmed out of music ed starting off, and then it became its own thing. So there can always be like a little bit of butting heads there. But I think when you decide to incorporate them into each other, it just creates this beautiful thing. Hence that choir director of yours introducing you to music therapy. And it's clearly something that has stuck.
Yeah, I don't think it was something that like they knew much about either. But they had kind of known like, oh, maybe Alex doesn't want to go into med school, and like, but this is what he wants to do. So it was kind of like, here are some options. Because it was, I think when I started the program, or even my senior year of high school, I was like, oh, I am going to do the dual track and do music ed, music therapy, which is possible. I know people who've done it, just very hard and very long, but that's kind of what we started with. And then toward the end of my senior year and then freshman year of college, I was like, nope, we will get rid of that music ed portion. I don't see myself doing that. And I think there was also a lot of growing of like, do I want to be in a classroom and teach like that? Or is there another type of teaching that I want to do? Which is what I think pushed that towards just music therapy at the time.
So moving forward, you go through school. So for our listeners, did you only get a degree in music therapy, or did you decide to pursue some other tracks?
So no, I did a double major in music therapy and psychology. The nice thing about UMKC's program was that there were most of the gen ed, like the basic level psychology classes as electives for the program. So I think it was only 6 classes in addition that I took to do the double major. And then I went into my undergrad with college credit for like Psych 101 related courses. So it didn't really add anything to my degree, but it's also like that's not entirely possible for everyone. I had people in my cohort who either double majored because they had circumstances similar to mine, or they did like a psych minor, but that was very much just because of how UMKC at the time had done their programming, and that there were plenty of electives for us to choose from. And we kind of noticed like, oh, these are electives that we're not getting in our core classes, so why not add them?
I see. Yeah, it kind of paired in and it was applicable, and it could open up a lot of opportunities for the future.
Yeah. If I would have taken a Spanish class and I think 2 math classes, I would have graduated with like 2 actual degrees as opposed to a double major. But I did not want to do that to myself. 21 credits every semester is enough.
Yeah, I completely understand. So you go through your undergraduate schooling and you go through your internship. If you want to speak a little bit on that, you can. And then we can kind of see where you've gone from there.
Yeah. So I completed all of my coursework in May of 2018. And then in June or July of 2018, I started my internship at a residential psychiatric treatment facility for children and adolescents in South Kansas City. And I was there with a co-intern, Kaylee Campbell. We had done our undergrad together, so it was kind of a great pairing of, I already know this person and our strengths and weaknesses build off of one another. So I think we were a great dyad to have an internship. And so I did that 6 months there. And my first job was in corrections. So I worked at Lansing Correctional Facility, which is a correctional facility in Kansas. And I was there for 6 months and kind of realized the amount of stress that job was, as well as the lack of pay that job provided, was not enough for me to be there long term. I definitely learned a lot about myself, the correction system, and everything that is wrong with it. But then I found myself in community mental health, which is where I currently practice.
And while you were in community mental health, Where did you go for education from there? Did you decide to take a little bit off, take some classes just for like CMTEs? And for those who don't know, CMTEs are continuing education credits. But what does that look like for you once you started working at that community health setting?
So I started that job in June, and I also moved to a different location. And at the time I was like, oh, my friends don't live here. I don't have anything to do. And like, it was summer for my position, which seasonally has like highs and lows. And I was like, oh, I could go get another degree. Let's go get another degree. So I looked at programs that either were low residency or could be done completely online. I applied to 2 of them, I think, and I ended up at Colorado State doing their online masters, which has been a really good fit, but like totally applied on a whim with like no plan, just that like I wanted something else to do in my evenings and decided that completing a master's degree was what I was going to do.
Well, it must take quite a bit of dedication though, like in order to dedicate your time to that constantly every day or every week, in addition to all of the things that you're already doing with full-time work. I'm sure that wasn't as easy as a lot of other hobbies.
I guess you could say that. The nice thing about my position is that it is school-based. So when the schools are on break, I am not on break, but I'm not seeing clients generally during that time. So I have less responsibility there. And then my position is relatively flexible in regard to like the hours that I worked. So it was very much like, oh, at 5 o'clock, work is done. I can go like do my life and do the reading that I need to do and the classes that I need to take. And as I say this, I am definitely minimizing the experience of like, oh, grad school is hard. And like, this is a hard thing for people. And I also have to recognize that, yes, there have been moments of these 2 years where I have been like, oh, this was a choice that I made and I have to finish it. But like, this was a really hard choice. So I'm not here to say like, oh yeah, like go get a full-time job and also go to school full-time, take 9 credits a semester and like do that. And it's easy. It's not, but it is something that I do enjoy. I enjoy learning and I enjoy learning. So it wasn't like this was an extra thing. It was more like, you're going to do this because you want to do this.
Kind of showing to your character, it sounds like, of really wanting to pursue education and learning in whatever topic you find appropriate at the time. Now, what does it look like for you currently? Because, we're in COVID, everything's different. We're shifting in tiers. Some people have gotten their vaccines, some people haven't. How has that affected your clinical work?
Let's see. So March of 2020 was definitely, for everyone, that was definitely like everything froze and we don't know what we're doing. March 17th of 2020 was when we were told, hey, we're not going back into the office. You are working from home. We're going to transition to virtual. So from March until the end of this academic school year for the schools that I work with, we were virtual, which was really hard only because the nice thing about our services had been that parents didn't have to coordinate anything. We were going into the facility. We were going into the schools to provide the services. Parents didn't have to get their kid places, things like that. So with virtual, it was very much, oh, now we have to navigate this new modality, but we also have to plan with parents and schedule times with them. And we also can't do group, which is what all of my services generally are, as opposed to individual. So we had to break all of our groups into individual services and ask parents like, hey, do you even want this right now or do you not? So during that time, March to June, some days looked like music therapy, traditional telehealth music therapy. Some days it really looked like, hey, I'm going to call these guardians. I'm going to check in, see if there's anything that our organization can do, whether or not that's like rent assistance, or do you have enough PPE? Do you have access to food? Things like that. And so during that time, our role across our agency, not just expressive therapists, kind of took on that dual therapist case manager role, where we weren't only managing the therapeutic needs of the people that we were working with, but also just like their life needs. So do you not have access to food? Can we connect you with a food pantry? Can we connect you with someone who can bring that to you? So that's what it looked like from March to June. And then in June, the schools kind of figured out what they were doing, and they started summer school back up, and they were doing a virtual summer school and an in-person summer school. So we provided some virtual services for their summer school. And then here in Missouri, schools went back to in-person learning in September. So because the schools were in person, we were also in person, which was not maybe my favorite choice, but it also didn't go as poorly as I thought it was going to go. So I have been back to in-person work since September.
You said a lot of really important things just now. I think one of the biggest ones was, for us as therapists, one of the big shifts that we see is not just the need to shift to providing services through telehealth, but also like, what do those services look like? Like, are people's basic needs being met before they're able to address any type of, social, emotional, cognitive, physical needs as well? So I'm really happy that you said that for our listeners too. But also, going back into that school setting, I'm sure that was like a culture shock because everything's different now. And I'm sure in the way you facilitate too.
Yeah. So my agency was really proactive, and we, at the time, this was really early on when everyone was sanitizing their groceries, because the data had suggested that like COVID and coronavirus did exist on surfaces for an extended period of time. We purchased instrument kits for all of the individuals on our caseload. So the experiences that we now provide are kind of based on those kits, which is like a drum, some egg shakers, some scarves, rhythm sticks, boom whackers, xylophones, things like that, things that can be easily sanitized and that we can get multiple of, like hundreds of, for the people that we work with. And so that's kind of what has shaped the experiences for this semester. With that said, some of our rules and guidelines are being relaxed a little bit, so we can now share instruments in some settings, and in some cases we can sing if masked and all the ventilation is appropriate and things like that. The second half of the semester has definitely been a little different than the first, but the first half was very much, okay, what can we do with egg shakers and rhythm sticks? So that changed. Some of the group sizes had to change as well. Most of my groups, I'd like to keep at 8, but because of spacing in schools, they're now at like 4. But again, it really depended on the school that we were at.
Well, thank you for filling us in. I think that'll be helpful too for those who don't really know about school-based music therapists in that way, or community services as well. Now, we're getting to kind of where it ramps up to our topic. This is our last question before it, but it is one of my favorite questions. And it is, what do you contribute to the world of music therapy?
What a good question. I'm not entirely sure. I think that, okay, so let me back up and say that I am innovative as a music therapist and do contribute to the profession, but I don't think that I would be able to contribute to the profession in the way that I do without the connection to people and grad school and all of the things that got me there first. And I think that's probably across the board a very large theme, is that the people who are in charge, quote unquote, of music therapy and the profession, and AMTA or CBMT, if you would like to throw those in there as well, are generally people who hold some form of privilege and are then able to leverage that privilege for better or for worse. So I would say that one, the things that I think that I do and have done would not have been possible without the amount of privilege that I also have. With that said, I think that some of my research, which has been on LGBTQIA2 plus service users and what music therapy looks like for us, and how we can improve that. I think that's something that I am hoping to contribute to the profession. I've also given some presentations on that at the regional and national level. So that's maybe one area that I'm contributing to the profession. I guess another way that's less academic is just making sure that as a music therapist, the job that I am doing is the best that it can be for the circumstances that I'm given. I think a lot of times we think that advocacy has to look like us talking to our council people or CEOs of companies or state legislature and things like that. And yes, advocacy can look like that, but advocacy can also look like you doing a really good job at your job, so much so that they're not going to hire an activity person to do your job. So maybe that, I don't know. I wouldn't say that I'm super innovative in like what I do and that I contribute a lot, but I try when I can.
I think every music therapist is innovative in their own way. And once again, speaking in the ways of how you view advocacy is a great way to be innovative. I haven't heard many people verbally share that perspective, that just by doing your job really well and demonstrating that to people who aren't music therapists, that's a really great way of showing, this is real, this is valid, this is enough. So I also appreciate you saying that. And within our profession too, any type of resources for the LGBTQIA2 plus community is really great and is something that is needed. So 2 wonderful things that you're doing. And thank you so much for sharing like all of these perspectives and these needs in the community, because that's the best way we can grow, is to have these areas that we're working towards. So that actually brings us to our topic today, and one that we will speak right after the commercial break. So stay tuned, and I can't wait for you all to hear what we are going to dive into. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Once again, we're talking to Alex Peuser about his journey through music therapy and bringing us to our topic today, which is MTBC to MM to PsyD. So he has decided to pursue the track of getting that psychology education in the graduate level. But I don't want you to hear from me. I want you to hear about him and his decision process and what that looked like. So Alex, if you'd like to just take it away.
Yeah. So as Brian had said, I am completing a master's right now. And then in the fall, I will start a PsyD program, which is not like my master's degree, not a spur of the moment choice. This is actually something that I knew that I had wanted to do even while applying for my undergrad. I remember being in an interview with Dr. Groney and Dr. Belgrave at the time for my UMKC interview, and them asking that very far out there question, what do you want to do in the future? What does your future look like? And I think they were very much expecting me to say, oh, I'm going to be a music therapist and I'm going to do this and I'm going to work here and I'm going to work with these types of people. And instead, my answer was, oh, I'm going to be a music therapist, but I'm going to continue and become a clinical psychologist. And I remember in the interview, Dr. Groney just saying, oh, that's a really long route for school. And do you think that you'll be able to get what you need with this program and things like that, which I did. But some of our music therapy education is kind of what has led me to feel the need to continue into this type of grad school. So that's kind of how that started. I knew very early on that being a clinical psychologist was what I had wanted. And then it was just a matter of getting there and doing that. So in order to start that process, I double majored in music therapy and psychology in my undergrad in order to get some doctoral programs require 18 credits of psychology. Some doctoral programs require 36. So to make sure that I had any of the psychology prereqs that would be necessary for a doctoral program, I did all of that in my undergrad. Then it was a matter of determining what type of degree I wanted. Did I want the traditional PhD, or did I want a newer degree, the PsyD? And there was a lot of going back and forth as to what that looked like for me and what I wanted. Because at the time in my undergrad, I knew that I wanted to teach. Didn't really know what I wanted to teach, but I knew that I wanted to teach. So I was like, oh yeah, the PhD, that's the route we're going to go. PhD is also generally funded, so you are not paying for the degree and you are generally teaching and researching, then being paid for that. Granted, it is a graduate level stipend, which is not livable, but you are paid. And then I kind of realized, and this was more in my master's program, that as of right now, music therapy does not require a doctorate to teach music therapy. Master's level and experience is what is required. And so that kind of opened my ideas and my mind to like, oh, I could do a PsyD, and clinical practice is really what I want anyway. So let's maybe go that route and really focus on clinical practice because that is what I want to do, get experience as a clinician, and then I can go back and teach at a school for music therapy. I can go back and teach within a psychology department. I would never be a tenured professor because that's unfortunately how that works, not having a PhD as opposed to a PsyD, but I could always be adjunct. Or I could go to a school that teaches professional counselors or social workers and teach classes there. But largely clinical practice, I think now is where my brain is. Not to say that I don't want to research and teach and do those things, but I was able to get most of the groundwork laid in my master's degree for that so that I can go and do any or either after this next degree.
Yeah, wonderful. Definitely keeping your options open. Now, I do want to clarify for our listeners who may not be familiar with the psychology routes as well as kind of music therapy education in general. So for music therapy education, just so that you all know, Alex made a really great point. It's not required for you to have your PhD to become a professor. That being said, there are plenty of professors who do have their PhD as well as professors who have their master's. It just depends which track. And a lot of times it depends on which school you choose as well. So if you're thinking about going into music therapy, that's something really important to take into account. That being said as well, you mentioned a PsyD and a PhD. With the PsyD being newer, for those, the context of that is that the PsyD was introduced in the 1970s. So it is fairly new in terms of education for sure. Alex, would you like to speak on the differences between the PhD and PsyD in a little more depth for our listeners?
Yeah. And I will largely say that my definition of these differences is probably biased. The PhD is the traditional clinical psychology degree. It is older and it follows the scientist practitioner model. Generally, most of them follow the Boulder model, which comes out of a conference that happened in Boulder, Colorado. And that kind of set up the framework for this type of education. And the idea with the PhD is that you are training to be a researcher as well as a clinician, but your research experience drives and then kind of influences your clinical mindset, which overall, that is how I believe much of clinical practice should work. The PsyD is focused more on clinical practice. So as a PsyD student, you are not a part of a lab. you are not going to be doing as much research as you would within a PhD program. You will still do research, but it's not going to be lab driven. It's generally going to be a project that you're working on with maybe your mentor or your dissertation. And then because the PsyD is clinically focused, you generally, depending on your program, start clinical practicum year 1, whereas the PhD, it's sometimes year 2 or 3 that you're getting that clinical focus. So really the PsyD is gearing you up to be a clinician. With that said, in recent years, probably the last 10 to 20, the lines between those two have been very much blurred, and the differences have become less. Early on in the PsyD history, it was kind of viewed upon as the lesser degree. Like, people who get this degree are just going to be practicing as clinicians. They are not going to be teaching. They are not going to be doing research X, Y, or Z. However, that has kind of been, those lines have been softened. And now we see a difference there as to, hey, you can teach, you can do research, you can do both of these things. It's now more the orientations of the schools that are different. But then again, this is based on my experience. I'm sure there are going to be people out there who are like, no, you have to have a PhD to research, or no, you have to have a PhD to do this. So it's kind of personal preference and what you want, as well as what you can afford. Again, the PhD programs are typically funded, but because they are funded, they are highly selective, as in, like, some of the programs that I applied to that were PhD programs had hundreds of applicants and selected 2 people from that pool of hundreds of applicants, whereas the PsyD program still had hundreds of applicants and accept anywhere from 30 to 50, depending on the school. So, and they're not funded. So you're not being paid to teach. You're not being paid to research. You are paying for this out of pocket.
And to talk to that a little bit more, not only are they funded, but often PhD programs are fully funded. So you don't have to pay anything.
Yes, they are free, and then they pay you.
So it's a wonderful opportunity if that's the type of education you want to pursue. Now, for those who are considering, maybe music therapists, or maybe individuals who just want to continue to get their PsyD or PhD, what is some advice you have for looking at schools and things to keep in mind to ask yourself before you decide to pursue such a long route in life, I guess, is kind of what I'm trying to get at there.
Yeah. So I think the first piece of advice that I have is really understanding the difference between master's level entry therapists and doctoral level entry therapists. You can be a clinical mental health therapist with a master's degree. You would go and become a social worker or a clinical counselor, and you would go that route, which I think for many people is totally fine. So I'm really understanding, can I do what I want to do with just a master's degree? If that is what you want to do, then maybe go just the master's degree route. And I shouldn't say just master's degree, because acquiring a master's degree is a hard thing to do.
Yes.
So you could go that route, and there's nothing wrong with that. Or you could understand that maybe what you want to do is going to require you to have the type of training that a doctoral program is going to provide you, especially in clinical psychology. So not only do clinical psychologists learn how to do therapy, but clinical psychologists also learn how to assess clients and write up those assessments, which is typically different than the master's level clinician. Master's level clinicians can sometimes diagnose, and they can definitely provide therapy, but they cannot always run a battery of assessments, which is something that you learn in the 5 years that you are in a doctoral program. You learn how to do therapy as well as do those assessments. So if that's something that you're interested in, perhaps doctoral work is for you. But then, like, for me, I was thinking like very long term, as like, oh, eventually I do want to teach. And yes, eventually I want to teach at a university, and that might require a doctorate. But then I also, at the time, and this might change again, but at the time I had also wanted to be in charge of like a behavioral health center or like a behavioral health unit within a center. And I'm not saying that you can't do that as a master's level clinician, but largely individuals who hold those types of positions are individuals who have doctorates. And whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing can be debated. But that was kind of my thinking. I also, like, from a very purely vain matter, really just wanted to be able to be called Dr. Peuser. I have wanted that for a very long time.
We all want the doctor in front of our name. It sounds very nice. It has a nice ring to it.
Yes. But I think for me, largely, it was understanding that what I wanted and what I wanted long term could not be achieved right now as a master's level therapist. That didn't answer your question about applying to schools, but
no, that you had a wonderful take on kind of deciding what route to take for you and kind of making the decision between, counseling, masters in psychology, doctorate in psychology, etc. So then when it came to looking at schools, do you find, as there is in music therapy, there's specializations that you can go into? Is that mimicked within the psychology field?
Yeah, it is. So within psychology, there are different emphases. And when I was looking, I really wanted to work with mentors who were interested in trauma and had a research line in relation to trauma and traumatic stress. But I also wanted to work with a school that understands that school is hard, and like not just hard because it is physically hard, but that there are barriers to higher education for so many people. And how can the model that the school that I'm going to, which is going to be Adler, how can Adler look at its framework and produce socially just clinicians? That's kind of where Adler is going with their education. So they're really looking at, we're going to produce great clinicians, but we're also going to teach these clinicians to understand the societies in which they're working in, really understand cultural reflexivity. And so that was kind of what pushed me towards Adler, as well as a few other schools that I had applied to, that they had really taken the time to break down their curriculum to create an educational experience that I hope is going to be enriching in a way that not only makes me a good clinician, but makes me a better person.
That's wonderful to take that time to kind of focus in on those communities and how that also plays into the therapy. Kind of bringing it back really to what we were talking about earlier with music therapy. There's always all these different factors, and to find a school that mimics your passion for those individual identities and groups is really great to hear that exists. And sounds like a really inspiring thing.
We will see how it goes. I think everything will be fine in regard to that. But I think that the profession of psychology being older than music therapy has allowed for that to happen. I think that we can maybe agree that the social sciences, psychology, counseling, social work in general are at times problematic and oppressive practices, and that there are people within those professions who have really worked to counteract that. And I think we see similar things happening within the profession of music therapy. It can be really frustrating though to see it happening at maybe such a slow pace when we see these other professions doing these things. So I think that kind of going back to music therapy is something that our profession can do and is doing, but could do faster.
And I would love for you, we're talking about this kind of vaguely, so I'd love for us to get a little more in depth with it. What does that oppressive structure look like within, Like, how is that shown for those who may not be as familiar or just starting to learn about race and learning about educational structures and levels and all of these huge concepts that we've been talking about lately? What does that look like in terms of a field, either in psychology or in music therapy?
So I think in music therapy, one of the challenges that we have in regard to being a reflexive practice, being a practice that is as anti-oppressive as we can be, is that we are rooted in a very Western classical tradition. And I think that starts with our medium being music. And that is what is then valued within our profession, at least in the United States. Globally, probably not so much. But within the United States, because music and the music that we value here is Western classical, I think that's a starting point to maybe some of the problems that we see as a profession. I also think that there are frameworks that are being taught, or even schools of thought that are being explored within our profession, that could be broader or that just haven't been challenged. We talked about regions earlier, and I said that in the Midwest, we are largely cognitive behavioral, and we are. And so I think part of what we see as being problematic, quote unquote, within music therapy is these very siloed schools of thinking. And that could be changed by having faculty of different perspectives going to other regions. I would say that the people who I have studied with and worked with kind of all follow the same mentor tree. So if we were to look at their mentors and the mentors before them, and then their top mentor, we would see that everyone that I have worked with has had some cognitive behavioral influence or has had some neurologic influence in the Midwest. Whereas if we were to go to either of the coasts, we might see transpersonal thinking, or we might see a more humanistic approach. But I think that part of that comes from just the mobility of music therapists and being able to stay in one location, as well as probably the pay of music therapists and professors. We don't pay them enough, and we don't pay them enough to uproot their lives to go somewhere else to take their philosophy with them. So I think that's part of this problem, that we don't have maybe as global of a perspective as we could.
Do you think those chains of education are also associated with how relatively new the profession is? For those who don't know a whole lot about music therapy, it has been around formally in the way that we see it today in the profession since around World War II. It started off with with musicians serving veterans who were currently in service at the time, and they started pairing with the doctors and nurses in those settings. And the doctors and nurses noticed, hey, music's really beneficial. Let's go ahead and add you all to the team. And then they realized, oh, wait a second, you all don't really know what we're talking about most of the time. You don't really know these medical terms. So hence undergraduate, graduate, doctoral, eventually all of those were created. So that's kind of a little bit of context behind music therapy. Do you think that might be a reason why you're finding these trees of similar education through all of the professors, is also because of how relatively new the profession is?
Yes. I think definitely, even thinking back to some of my professors in undergrad, they would have studied with individuals who your professors from undergrad studied from, even though we went to very different schools with very different schools of thought. So yes, partially because there are not enough doctoral level music therapists out there to teach. That's part of it. And that's not to say that our profession is the only profession to have these problems. Psychology, social work, clinical counseling, it's all ableism and oppression is all wrapped up into that. The difference is that our profession music therapy is so small. There are 9,000 of us who are certified through CVMT. And so approximately 9,000 of us. We can see these things at a very close level because we are so small. Whereas with psychologists, I can't go to another state and say, oh, I know 5 psychologists who live here. But I can go to almost any state in the United States and say, I know at least 2 music therapists who live here. So part of us just being a very small profession, I think magnifies what we're seeing. And that's not to say that what we are seeing is not a bad thing that should be dismantled. It definitely should be. The oppressive practices within our organizations, AMTA or CBMT, need to be addressed and dismantled. The ableism that we see within clinical practice should be addressed. But we as music therapists see it as we see it much differently because we are so small. Also because it's what we're looking for as music therapists.
And tying that in, I really want to make sure we connect that to this series of education that you're pursuing. Within psychology, what is that kind of looking like? What are the limitations? How are they being addressed? Is this being talked about as much from your experience? I know you haven't begun the program yet, but I'm sure you've done some research into what that looks like, hence the program that you selected.
Yeah, so it's definitely being talked about. And this would be probably where music therapy has a better standing, because music therapy is so small. We can make these changes, and we can make the changes that we wish and need to see quickly if we were to organize in a better way. I don't know what that way looks like, but if we were to organize differently, those changes could be addressed. Whereas in psychology or social work or counseling, those professions have been established and have been around for a very long time. So there is a lot of hesitancy and even pushback to a lot of these ideas. So like APA, the American Psychological Association, which is set up very similarly to AMTA, those two structures are the same but very different. APA has a long history and lots of people in charge and like working towards these things, whereas AMTA is really us as music therapists. So we could make that change differently. I would say that yes, in a more succinct manner, these problems exist across the board. I do, though, think that music therapists could change these things probably quicker than other organizations and professions can because of how new we are. But that did go into my choice of choosing a school. I wanted a school that really recognized these problem areas or areas for growth from the get-go, as opposed to an institution that was going to kind of skirt around those things or not name them, and not name them as something that is uncomfortable. I wanted a school that, at least on paper and on their website and through conversation with faculty, seems to understand that, hey, we do have these problems. Here's how we're going to create you to be a clinician that is going to address these problems.
Well, thank you so much for kind of showing that distinction between the two, but also showing how the issues are tied. You know, not everything's so black and white. There's a lot of times there's this blurring lines between cultural acknowledgement and then actual activism. And I think those can be magnified when there's such a small pool to choose from in the profession and things like that. So we're getting towards the end of our time together today, but is there anything else you'd like to talk on regarding your PsyD, or any advice that you'd like to continue to give anybody who might be considering the same route before we wrap up for today?
Yeah. So I think advice-wise, really having an understanding of what you want to do and why you want to do it. I know I started this interview saying, like, I wanted to be a music therapist because I wanted to help people and do like all of these things. And that is still totally true. And that is why I want to be a clinical psychologist. But that came about because of parts of education that I thought were missing in my training as a music therapist. I think that our training relies heavily on some of our board certification domains and the competencies set forth by AMTA. And I think that that's an okay thing. But I think that that sets people up, especially new music therapists, to believe that they can work anywhere and everywhere as long as they have met those competencies. And I don't think that that is the case. And because we are a competency-based profession right now that is not master's level entry, I think that can be really harmful for the people that we work with. For example, I work in mental health, and I have only ever worked in mental health, even in my clinical practica. So I would never, even though I could, go apply for a job in a school district focusing on 504 or IEP-based goals and objectives. I would not be able to do that in a way that makes me feel good about the job that I'm doing. With that being said, I totally could, and the people hiring me wouldn't know one way or the other if they are not music therapists. Conversely, I think that we look at music therapy and hear the word therapist, and so we think of music therapy as the very traditional therapy that could then use music, which is eventually what I will do someday. But I don't think that we're trained to do that. And I don't think we're trained to do that well unless you take an active role in your education and choose and have the ability to choose clinical sites to do that. For example, I don't think that music therapists are largely trained to safety plan with a client. I don't think that music therapists are trained largely in de-escalation, things that would be necessary to work in a very specific aspect of the profession. So really understanding what you want to do, and understanding that that might look like you pursuing a degree that is not in music therapy after your undergrad, at least right now, while we are not master's level entry. If we ever move toward that again, that might change.
Yes, a lot of times the degree that we have, a lot of us, like you're saying, choose different routes to go in. Now, that's not to say that you can't switch mid-career into something else. I think the real key takeaway from what you said there is to really make sure you have the education and you pursue the education in the areas that you want to work in. For example, although we aren't given by default those crisis trainings and things that you were speaking on, that is something that you can pursue while working in a setting that you do have more experience in. And that really just comes down to the individual therapist and deciding, what is your scope based on your education? And if you want to widen your scope, what does the education look like to get there?
Exactly. And at least for what I want to do, that it will require a doctorate. So that's what got me here.
Well, I'm so excited to see all the things that you're going to accomplish in the future. And I know our audience will enjoy hearing this as well. What are ways that our audience can reach out to you and contact you if they want more information?
You can always shoot me a message on Facebook. It is just my name. I do tend to check those messages that don't go right into my normal inbox. And then you could follow me on Instagram. Again, just my name. You don't really have to. I don't post anything important there. Or you can shoot me an email. I am sure that my email will be put somewhere in the description of this podcast. So that would probably be your best bet, is you can shoot me an email. I tend to get to those quicker than anything else.
We'll have the emails in the show notes. Well, thank you, Alex, so much for being on the show and sharing your voice and your thoughts and really helping the listeners see what a path could look like if they decide to go from music therapy and continue to pursue either a PhD or a PsyD.
You're very welcome.
Tune in next time to hear our Voices of Music Therapy episode. And remember, you can always follow us on Instagram or Facebook, or check out our Anchor, where you can hear all of the different episodes that we have had so far. And once again, I want to thank you all for following us on this journey, and feel free to click subscribe so that you can get notified every time a new episode comes out. If you'd like to see today's guest or learn more about the show, check us out on Facebook or Instagram at Voices of Music Therapy, or on Twitter at VOMT Podcast. If you have any questions or if you know any innovative music therapists and would like to recommend them for the show, you can email us at voicesofmusictherapy@gmail.com.